Okay, welcome everybody. We are going to talk about Salesforce.com integration options with NetSuite OpenAir. So this is the agenda, what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about the data flows. What I mean by that is what data you can push from what system to where. We're going to talk about within those directional data flows what configuration options you have or considerations to think about. And then we're going to end it with avoiding some fairly common pitfalls and some best practices. What we are not going to cover is anything custom. Okay, so if you want to write code and access the APIs of either or both systems, you're free to do that, but we're not going to cover that for the purposes of today's webinar. There are probably other tools out there that can be made to work. I'm aware of a couple of them at least to do integrations between the two systems in different ways. We're really talking about the standard integration that's provided by NetSuite OpenAir. And we're also not going to get too creative today. My purpose in today is to cover, the common, this is really what it was designed to do. I've seen some creative things, and they're really neat in a lot of cases, but we're not going to dig into those today. And I'm not going to tell you exactly how to do all the things we're covering. So we're not going to look at the actual code. I'm not going to say, do step 1 through 5 to do this thing. This is really just about what's possible and what to think about. So again, this is a standard integration from NetSuite OpenAir. So they built it. It uses a combination. In some cases it uses Salesforce's API. In some cases it uses OpenAir's. It's a set of tools that you have to configure and set up, but it is somewhat limited in what it was designed to do, but that's what we're talking about. You have to buy it. So if you don't have this already and you're thinking about it, you have to talk to your sales rep from NetSuite and purchase that. It can be a scheduled automated integration, or you can manually trigger it. We'll talk about those details. And even though it is somewhat limited, there are lots of options available that we're going to cover. So let's jump right into data flows. All right, I'm going to give you a little bit of time with this slide to let it kind of sink in. What this shows is, from Salesforce on the left, what data can you push to OpenAir, and can it come back the other way? And in that type column, you see whether it's automated or manual. In most cases, if it's automated, it can also be manual. When we talk about the basic vanilla integration, you're usually talking about the opportunity in Salesforce pushing to OpenAir to create a project. Included in that, the account from Salesforce creates or updates the customer or the client record in OpenAir. And those are two-way integrations that can be automated or manual. So that's kind of the middle of the road vanilla, really what you start with. Now optionally you can add other integration points that it supports. So contacts, you can push contacts from Salesforce to OpenAir. Even though I have two directions there, it's really you only want to push it one way. That's to OpenAir. Opportunity products. So if you're using this in your opportunities in Salesforce, some people call them opportunity line items or product line items. If you're using those can be pushed to OpenAir to create budgets. Technically the budget line items if you're using that feature in OpenAir. So there's a lot of ifs involved with that. You can also use the opportunity products to create tasks in OpenAir. And then finally, if you're using Salesforce for support and you're using the case object, you can integrate those with tasks in OpenAir. So those last four, I have a little asterisk to say that they're optional. Not everybody uses all of them. I would say most commonly they're not used, but they certainly are possible, and we'll talk about them. All right, so let's dig into the opportunity project data flow. First of all, it's a scheduled two-way sync. So what this means is you can send data from one system to the other system and back and forth, okay? And this is the automated aspect of it. There is also a manual aspect. You can push an opportunity, a single opportunity from Salesforce, navigate it to there, and then push it, and it will update the project in OpenAir. Or manually, you can trigger all opportunities that are linked to OpenAir. You can basically, from OpenAir, you pull all qualified opportunities to update everything in OpenAir. All right, let's start with that automated sync. This is really controlled from the OpenAir side. It's a little bit confusing if you're not familiar with this. So when you're using the scheduled, automated, run every day kind of integration, you set that up in OpenAir, and I'm going to show you that. This is the only actual live part of the demo that I'm going to walk you through. So what you're looking at is our Top Step account. And this is the page within the account where you set up all of the integration if you're using the automated sync integration. Also, by the way, if you want to use the the opportunity budgets, the opportunity projects to the project budgets, then you have to use this because it uses the Salesforce API. So this is where you set up. I have my Salesforce login, my password, my security token, and then here I can define when I'm sending data from OpenAir to Salesforce, what fields do I want to map? So I can say, well, maybe if I update the project name, then maybe I update the opportunity name in Salesforce. I don't think that's the right Salesforce field name, but you get the idea. This is pushing OpenAir data to Salesforce. I can do it for projects, clients, tasks, and contacts. And then this last section here, or you can ignore all this and leave it blank. This last section is where you define which opportunities should be included in that sync. There's two ways of doing that. I can either do it the way it's listed here, which is by opportunity stage names. So any opportunity in any of these stages will be included. Or I can do it with a custom field. So I can define it so that if a field in the opportunity has a particular value, then include that in the automated integration. That can be really handy because you can use formula fields and define all sorts of logic to qualify which opportunity should be included. We'll cover that in a minute. And then you can schedule it. You can do it weekly, one day of the week. Typically people do every day, a particular day of the month. What you can't do is more frequently than every day. However, if you want to do an update more than that, you can manually go here, and at the very bottom of this page, you can run the custom link that way. Okay, so that's just a quick introduction to what the setup looks like if you haven't seen it from OpenAir. All right. When you're looking at the manual integration of opportunity to project, it looks something like this. Within Salesforce, you have either a button at the top or potentially a link at the bottom. But they work the same way. It takes the opportunity that you're in currently, and it will either create a new project in OpenAir if it doesn't exist, or update the project if it does exist. And then again, the other manual integration I just showed you, this is that link at the bottom from OpenAir where you can pull everything. The difference being, of course, whether you want to just update a single opportunity or update all of them. All right, this is something just to point out briefly. In some cases, people who are running Salesforce.com already have a custom object in Salesforce that they use to track project data. If you're already doing that and you'd rather have opportunities separate and then create a project record in Salesforce for whatever reason, you can integrate any custom object to a project in OpenAir. I don't want to get too creative again today, but this is a somewhat common thing that we've seen where we're just integrating projects in Salesforce to projects in OpenAir, and opportunities are just out of the loop altogether. So it's just one of the ways that's possible. All right, let's talk about the account client integration. Where you're going directionally from Salesforce to OpenAir. This is really built into the opportunity integration code. When you push an opportunity, part of that includes updating or creating the account. Okay, so when you initially create the opportunity, it looks for, hey, does this account or client already exist in OpenAir? If not, it creates a new one. If it does already exist, it updates it if any of the data is different. Now, I put it on this slide here on the bottom. We don't recommend it, but technically it's possible, so I'm pointing it out. You can send client data back to Salesforce. The reason we don't recommend it is because Salesforce is generally your system of record for customers. If it's not the primary system of record, it's at least got more authority, if you will, than OpenAir does. So typically you don't want to update customer data in OpenAir because it's not the system that owns that record. So just pointing it out. Contacts. You can create contacts from Salesforce, push them into OpenAir. You might ask, why would I do that? Two main reasons. If you're sending invoices out of OpenAir, contacts can be established as invoice recipients. So maybe you have your AP contacts for your customers in Salesforce already. Just push them to OpenAir and set them up as an invoice recipient. And then the other thing, of course, if you're not doing this already, is you can share reports with contacts so they don't have to have a login. If you want to automatically schedule those reports to be emailed out to customers, that's the other way to do it. It's just a button on the contact record. Just push it to OpenAir, and that's it. And for the same reasons I mentioned before, you don't really want to update contacts on OpenAir and push it back to Salesforce. It really should be the system of record for contacts. All right. So opportunity products to OpenAir budgets. Just to clarify again, not everyone uses Salesforce this way. You don't have to use opportunity products. But if you are already, and you have multiple line items on opportunities, you can use those line items to create budget line items. Okay, so when you set this up, it's included. Anytime the project gets updated, it also looks at the products and budgets to update those as needed. And commonly, especially if you're selling any kind of product that's not services related that you don't want in OpenAir, you can filter it so that only your services related line items in your opportunities get pushed to the project budget. Right? So you have an opportunity that has maybe 2 service line items and 3 product line items. So your opportunity may be $500,000, but the services component is only $200,000. Right? So you only want those $200,000 worth of products flowing over to create your budget in OpenAir, and you can do that. All right, case to task. If you have a support organization that's using Salesforce cases and you want them to enter time against those cases in OpenAir so that the data is in both systems, there is a way to do that. It starts with a manual push on the case. So you're in Salesforce, you take a case, maybe it just gets assigned to you. You say, okay, I know I'm going to need to enter time against this, so I'm going to push it to OpenAir. There's a link on the case. When you push that button, it will give you a pop-up that says, okay, I see that this case is for Acme Corp. Which opportunity for Acme is this related to? You pick that opportunity so that it knows, okay, I'm going to update that related project on that opportunity. And it creates a task with data from that case. So that's how the initial creation works. And then there's a reverse integration that can take OpenAir data and populate it back to Salesforce so that if you close the task in OpenAir, it can close the case in Salesforce. You don't necessarily want to do it that way, but it certainly is possible. And then you can also take more, what I think is more valuable, take the work, billed, and approved hours against that task and update the case with it. So that can be pretty handy. All right, we're going to drill a little bit deeper into these data flows. Starting with the opportunity to project push, keep in mind that if you're going to push an opportunity to OpenAir, you have to have a user record set up in OpenAir that has the role permissions to create projects. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because if you have a salesperson in Salesforce thinking, I'm going to help out professional services and create their project for them, the salesperson has to also have permission in OpenAir to create that project. So in many cases, you have somebody trying to push a project saying, it's not letting me, it's broken. Well, it's built that way on purpose because you want to make sure that the only people creating projects are the people that are set up with permissions to do so in OpenAir. So if they can't push it, that could be a reason why. All right, so when you are updating the project to the opportunity, this actually uses a single administrator user. So this is, again, the scheduled daily, usually, push from OpenAir back to Salesforce. You're updating any data that way. In this case, it doesn't use whoever's pushing it or whoever scheduled it. It's using a single administrator user. Okay? So you don't have those permission issues when you're going back the other way from OpenAir to Salesforce. Now the opportunity to the project, I think we covered this already. It can be based on the opportunity stage. But think about the power, potentially, of using a formula to define which opportunities should be included in that scheduled push. Maybe you have opportunities of different service lines or different product types or different divisions. Right? So if you need to segment, we only want these opportunities to be pushed to OpenAir automatically. And you can define that at different levels too. So maybe it's region in addition to opportunity stage, in addition to some other fields. So you can build a formula field in Salesforce that says if all these conditions are true, then display a value of OK to push or something like that. So you can get pretty granular and have flexibility. You can also do it based on date ranges, which can be useful. So maybe if the close date is older than 90 days ago, you want to stop that automated push so you're not churning through too much data. Things like that. All right. We're not going to look at the actual integration code, but at the highest level, it includes these sections. The credentials, first of all. This is, again, from the opportunity to the project. So this is, it's going to say whoever's clicking the button, use their OpenAir credentials. Now I have seen it to where you can code a single user so that whoever pushes the button from the opportunity doesn't have to have OpenAir credentials because it's using some administrative user. So I have seen that done, and it is possible. I don't always recommend it. It's the kind of thing that we would talk through because you just want to be sure that anyone who is doing that has permission to do that. But it's another possibility. And then client data on the initial push in each time, and project data on the initial push in each time. The other thing that I didn't put here but is also included is if you're updating tasks from opportunity products or budgets from opportunity products, that's also defined here. All right. This is an exercise to demonstrate. Suppose that you're either rethinking your integration or starting from scratch. Here's just a few fields here that I want to walk you through. When you think about, should this data be pushed only the first time, or should it be pushed every time the scheduled integration runs? Okay, so let's walk through these. The first one is the opportunity name is going to populate the project name. The question you want to ask is, which system should own the project name? Is it OpenAir or Salesforce? Well, I think you want to be able to change the project name in OpenAir. So therefore, OpenAir we're going to say is the system owner. So therefore, we only want to populate that in the initial push when the project is created. It would equal the opportunity name. But after that, you want to be able to control it from OpenAir, right? Conversely, let's say you're mapping the Salesforce probability to a custom field in OpenAir that you're calling probability. Well, you don't really want to update that in OpenAir. You just want to read it in OpenAir and control it from Salesforce. So in that case, we're not going to say that's initial only. We're going to say every time it's updated, Salesforce is going to push that data to OpenAir, right? And then this third example here, we have project stage. Again, once we move the project to a stage in OpenAir, we don't want Salesforce to override that, so that's an initial only type of a thing. So the question you want to ask is, which is the system owner? Do I want to update this data in Salesforce and then read it in OpenAir, or do I want to update it in OpenAir and have Salesforce not override it? That's the question you want to ask to determine whether it should be pushed initial only or each subsequent push. All right, a couple other things to think about. If you're using hierarchies in projects, you can map that from the opportunity. It's a little bit tricky to set up, but it's certainly doable. If you think it's simple and say, I'll just have a drop-down that has the name of the hierarchy, it's not quite like that, but it's certainly possible. Think about project templates. If you have multiple templates, there are different ways to do this. Maybe you say every time you push a project, you use a single template. And you just hard code that template every time, and then you build the rest of it out in OpenAir. The other way to do it is you can say, no, we're going to select which template we use to create the project in the opportunity. Just different ways to do it. The project owner, you want to hard code that so the same owner gets assigned each time you create a new project. For smaller companies, I see this is pretty common. Maybe you have one central operations or services person who sets up all projects once they're pushed. So that person is the default owner. Or maybe you want to select that in Salesforce. So we're not going to really dig into the details of this, but it is possible to have a little pop-up in Salesforce where it allows you to select from active users in OpenAir who the project owner is. And all that happens in Salesforce before you push. And then think about how you can use formula fields in Salesforce to define conditional values. So here's a couple examples. Let's say based on a project type, if you have, let's say, 5 project types for 5 practices, and you know that based on the practice of the project, it's going to go to the practice leader as the project owner. Well, maybe you have a formula field in Salesforce that says, well, if I've selected a project type or a practice type, then automatically map that to a particular project owner. You can do that with formula fields. Another example to think about is filter set. So if when you create projects in OpenAir, you need to add that project to a particular filter set or group of filter sets, you can also define that based on maybe the region or the practice of the project, all within Salesforce first so that you don't have to add that later in OpenAir. So lots of flexibility with formula fields. Okay, let's talk about the products going to populate budgets. Now the standard fields that just kind of come out of the box that are populated is the name, which is going to be the product name. That'll be the budget name. The date, which uses either if the product line item or the opportunity product, if it already has a date populated, it'll use that. If not, it'll use the current date. And then, of course, the total, which is quantity times sales price. Pretty standard. So in addition to that, you can add service. If you're using services on budgets, not everybody does, but if you are, you can map that also. You can add custom fields. One of my favorites, a lot of people do this, is you'll add a custom field on your project budget line item for hours. It doesn't really roll up anywhere, but it can be good reference information where you can take that quantity and populate that hours field. And then most importantly, you can do product filtering. So back to my example before, you have maybe 3 product lines and 3 service lines on the opportunity. Only pull the service lines in to create budget lines in OpenAir. Okay, single sign-on. Part of the integration allows you to do single sign-on from within Salesforce. It only works that way. You can't go from OpenAir to Salesforce. There's 2 basic ways of doing this. The multiple tabs approach, they kind of look the same, right? But if you look a little bit closer, in the top approach where you have multiple tabs, you have to create a Salesforce tab to go, in this example, to the projects module in OpenAir. And it works, it's great. But once you're within the projects module, you can't navigate somewhere else, say to reports, unless that already exists in Salesforce. So if you do this approach, you want to be sure that you add all of the tabs that you'll need in Salesforce, maybe administration, maybe reports. Any module that people use, you want to add it in Salesforce. The other option is just have a single tab. And if you do that, then that shows you the top level navigation in OpenAir. So I go to a single tab in Salesforce, and I've got everything I need below that. It takes up more room, obviously, because you have that top level link there, but a little bit more flexibility. So both are possible. All right, especially when you are just beginning to set up the integration and test it and deal with the inevitable errors that happen as you're kind of fixing data and things like that. Every time the integration runs, there's a log that you can read. It'll be emailed to whoever you set up to receive that email. But of course, those emails get lost. So if you want to just log those in a single place, there's a way that you can just auto-save the integration log to a workspace. But I can't reiterate this strongly enough. Only use this for a little while. Don't just forget it and leave it, because what happens is it takes that entire log file and it appends it to a single file. So it might start off with a week's worth of data. Okay, that's manageable. But when you're talking about a year's worth of data in a single file, it just becomes a monster. So use this when you're troubleshooting, when you're setting things up, and you need to keep an eye on it and have that available, but then get rid of it after a while. Okay, pitfalls and best practices. You're limited to a certain number of characters when you actually write the code that pushes projects from opportunities. You only have a certain number of characters, and almost everyone runs out of space at some point. If you add too many fields, Salesforce will give you an error and say, hey, this is too long, you can't save it. Okay, so one of the things that you can do, actually let me talk about why that happens, because that's a really common question. Why is Salesforce telling me that it's too long? It's not really Salesforce's fault, and it's not really OpenAir's fault, it's the Internet's fault. Okay, because it uses an HTTP command. It just creates a really long URL. And depending on the browser you use, browsers can only read URLs that are a certain length. Different browsers have different length limitations. So Salesforce is actually doing you a favor and saying, hey, if you made this too long, certain browsers wouldn't be able to use it, and it's better to not create it at all if that's the case. So that's why that happens. One fix is if you're mapping custom fields, which usually you are, those custom field names can be renamed in both systems. So you can rename the actual, not the display name, but the field name both in Salesforce and in OpenAir. So if you had a long field that was like opportunity underscore product underscore 5, something like that, just rename that on the database to be OPTY 5. or something really short. Do that both on Salesforce and OpenAir, and you can save a lot of space. OpenAir is subject to Salesforce validation rules when it's pushing data from projects in OpenAir to Salesforce. Now, the reason I bring this up is because you may set up your integration, it works fine, no problem. Down the road, you create a validation rule on an opportunity. And that validation rule basically says you can't populate this field unless you populate that field, right? Well, that is enforced when OpenAir tries to push data back into the opportunity. So if you build that validation rule and OpenAir tries to populate this field but not that field, the validation rule will kick it out and say, nope, you can't update anything. So keep that in mind when you're adding validation rules, especially to opportunities. Read the logs. Can't tell you how many times we've seen cases where suddenly you find bad data and you want to know why this happened and when it happened, and we look at the logs and we realize, wow, we could have caught this a long time ago instead of stumbling across it weeks later. So have somebody who, even though it feels like spam, just glance at that file, look for failures, and respond to them. Okay, this is one of the more common pitfalls that I see, and this is what I call double system ownership. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through how this happens because it can be really confusing if it happens to you. So I'm going to walk you through the logic of why it seems like a good idea and then actually why it's a bad idea. So here's just one example. Let's say initially when you push the opportunity to OpenAir, you want to define who the project manager is. Good idea, right? No problem. But then you say, well, I know I'm going to reassign it in OpenAir to someone, and I want to take that change and reflect it in Salesforce. So I want to push it from Salesforce to OpenAir, and then from OpenAir back to Salesforce. That seems like a good idea on the surface, right? But what you're really doing is you're saying either system can update the other one. Let me walk you through why that's a bad idea and how it breaks it. So step one, we create a project with the project owner we'll call Adam. Okay? In OpenAir, it's Adam. In Salesforce, it's Adam. Step two, now in OpenAir, we're going to change the owner from Adam to Zoe. Okay, but in Salesforce, the integration hasn't run yet. We've just updated it in OpenAir, so Salesforce still shows it as Adam. Okay, no problem. Run the integration, it should fix it, right? Now, when you run the integration, the project pulls data from Salesforce, but in Salesforce, it's Adam, so we've just overwritten what we changed in OpenAir. And then we push that OpenAir data that was just overwritten, which is Adam, back to Salesforce, which is Adam. So what just happened? That change that we made in OpenAir was overwritten by the integration. Why? Because it does it in a particular sequence. So it's Salesforce to OpenAir, then OpenAir to Salesforce. So you can't really have both systems updating the same field. You have to pick an owner. So again, I go back to this chart that we looked at before. The question you want to ask yourself is, which system is the owner? This is what we looked at before, but in our example now, we wanted to say the project manager, both systems can own the data. So it's always updated. But as we just saw, that doesn't work. So we can't do that. We have to say, nope, OpenAir owns the project owner. If we're going to update it in Salesforce, then it has to be pushed the first time only from Salesforce to OpenAir, and then thereafter, only OpenAir updates Salesforce. So how you set that up is very, very important. All right. Best practices, spend a lot of time up front defining the process. Write it out. Build workflows. You really want to think about all the various scenarios that could come up. What if somebody pushes an opportunity too early? Will it work? What will it do? What if somebody pushes an opportunity and certain fields aren't populated? What will happen? What if, what if, what if? try to break the process with what-ifs and really, really test it a lot. You want to break it before you're live and people are depending on it than afterwards. And then balance the data completeness versus efficiency. What do I mean by this? What I mean is it's really tempting for your professional services and operations people to insist that, you know what, when these projects come from Salesforce, I expect them to be completely set up. I need my whole task structure, I need my billing rules, I need my properties form filled out, I need the right owner, I need everything done so I don't have to do anything. Okay, so on one side of the argument, that's data completeness. But what does that do? That forces whoever owns the opportunity, frequently it's sales, to know all that data and to populate it. But realistically, if those are required fields and they have to populate all that in order to push it, chances are, if they don't know and they're in a hurry, they're going to push something wrong. They're going to just say, I don't know what region this is. I'm just going to put West, right? Or I don't know who the owner is. It's probably John. I'll just pick John. So you end up with bad data if you insist that everything is complete. So think about, what does sales actually know? What's actually relevant to the opportunity versus what's relevant to the project? You don't really want to push sales too hard to populate data that isn't in their purview. Okay, so better to have good data that they don't have to struggle with than to have bad data because you insist it be complete. And then in general, start simple and build on it. I talked about a lot of options that are possible. Some of them you might be really curious about at this point and want to investigate. Great, but I recommend get something working that just pushes projects and it just works at a basic level. Stabilize that first, and then think about, okay, how can we extend this? How can we get more value out of it? All right. That is it for today. I'm going to unmute the lines in just a second. Keep in mind, if you go to our website there, topstepconsulting.com, we have a lot of good free information for you about OpenAir. All of these webinars are recorded, so you'll be able to see this recording probably next week, and all the ones we've ever done are there. We also have a lot of tips. A lot of information is out there, so please take advantage of that.